Where Are the Grown-Ups is my first book, and in shorthand terms I would describe it as a multi-generational family memoir. So it's about me, my mother Sylvia, and the grandmother I didn't know called Rose, and it reflects on the impact of a hidden tragedy within my family that affected us all, and that was Rose's death at the age of 25. Some parts of the story are written as my own lived experience, and other sections rely on historical research and information gleaned from historical documents, archives and journals. The story that was passed down was that Rose had died in childbirth, but it was never spoken about in any detail. We all knew that my mother was adopted by a great aunt and uncle, and I knew these people as my grandparents on my mother's side. I believe that something fundamental was missing in my mother's early emotional life, and this had consequences for how we related to each other as a mother and daughter. So my childhood and growing up forms the first part of the book. And to start with, I'm going to give you a brief extract which gives you really a flavour of my childhood and the tensions between my parents that I observed from the back seat of the car. So in this extract, I'm about 8 years old. It was a grey Saturday afternoon, and we were whirring through the London suburbs in Dad's Vauxhall Victor, a familiar journey we did at least once a month. I was silent in the back, listening to my own thoughts and trying to block out Mum's seething discontent in the front. The combined smell of Coty Lemon perfume and hair lacquer was overwhelming as usual. Opening a window was not allowed unless I was going to be sick, which never happened. Dad passed me his crumpled white handkerchief just in case, but I put it on the shelf behind me. The merest hint of moving air in the car could never be tolerated for fear it would compromise the achievements of the Elnet spray and its suffocating, extra hold mist. Our house was also a sealed unit because Mum said opening windows made the net curtains grubby with dust and let in dirt-loving insects. We stopped at some traffic lights, and with the engine idling, I stared at the passengers in the back seat of the car next to ours. A boy and a girl about my age were chattering, laughing and bouncing up and down on their seats. Their mum in the front turned to share a joke. The boy suddenly looked across and smiled at me through the window. I stuck out my tongue and turned away just as the lights changed and the Vauxhall jerked forward. I imagined him telling his side of the story. "Mum, a girl in that white car with the red roof just stuck her tongue out at me." He'd probably be pointing in the direction of our car, and his voice would have a "that's not fair" whine to it. I looked through the back window, watched the car take a left turn and slip out of sight. The realisation that I could be naughty without consequences was delicious. My mother wasn't the kind that other people had, one that played games with you during car journeys. She was the needy one in our family, the one whose mood could suddenly change, the one that must be considered, deferred to and placated, or else Dad would get a tongue lashing. I hated her for that, and the way she held on to her simmering anger and resentment like a weapon, always ready to be reloaded and discharged. I often thought there must be something wrong with me for having those feelings. Before we left the house today, I heard her tell Dad he drove her mad with his timekeeping. I heard him remind her of the need to get ready when she hadn't yet completed her polishing and tidying rituals, and she must have noticed him looking at his watch. That would be the reason for the tense atmosphere in the car and the gesture of displeasure which was my mother's trademark. A slow look at the offending party, then the eyelids closing in contempt before the final defiant toss and turn of the head, followed by a long gaze out of the passenger window. When I saw her do that, the heavy feeling started in my stomach and moved to my head. Dad tried to smooth it all over before we arrived at Grandma's flat. But it didn't work. Mum called it schmoozing. Don't start schmoozing me just because you're frightened of your mother. She won't die if we're a few minutes late, she snapped. I could see the top half of Dad's face in the driver's mirror. He did a strange sort of blink with his whole face when he heard that comment.
That's wonderful. Well, that certainly sets up the book, and you understand how you might be inspired to figure out why was my mother such a jerk. So we're going to do an interview with Ruth. We'll have about 50 minutes of me interviewing. We're going to stop about 25 minutes in, and then another 25 minutes for your questions from the chat. And then we're going to do a writing exercise, so you can think of additional questions along the way. If you, please, I think we've mentioned to just use the chat for questions and not to do a lot of commentary in there. So tell us about that moment of discovery when you saw the photo of your grandmother and why it has such a strong impact on you that led to writing the memoir.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Robin. So my mother died in May 2015, and in September of that year, I was involved in clearing her house of her possessions, the most difficult job that every child has to do for their parents sometime or other. It was emotionally very hard, and I described it in the early part of the book. Because my mother, it was hard because my mother was a material girl, and she was very particular about her possessions, and especially her clothes and how they were arranged. So I felt like a vandal handling these things in her absence. My mother was her possessions, and even looking at her shoes, I could see the shape of her feet. Everything I touched was potent with meaning and reminded me of who she was. So by the time I came across the family photos, every nerve in my body was jangling with grief and guilt and memories. And I expected to find the old family holiday snaps, things that were familiar. I wasn't prepared for what I found amongst them. And this photograph, as you can see, is not a snap. It's a professional portrait, and it really stopped me in my tracks. The inscription on the back simply said, "My mother," in such familiar handwriting. 2 words that carried so much meaning. And the image I'd never seen before. It seemed to me that she was looking ahead with such a clear gaze, so confident. And I drank in every detail of her face and the little touches of clothing and jewellery that you can see in that head and shoulders picture. She seemed to rise up in front of me like a ghost from the past, and her story was unknown. Somehow the future that we could all have had was captured in her expression, and it was a reminder to me that there was a mystery that was never explained, and this mystery connected us all to each other. I was living overseas at the time, so I took the photograph back, and my husband put it in a beautiful frame, and we hung it in a prominent place in our apartment. And I started writing the story, and the more I found out about Rose's short life and early death, the more powerful the image became to me. It was immensely helpful.
Somebody wrote in the chat that you look like her. I don't know if you feel that you look like...
It's probably not immediately apparent when you look at me now, but various people have said that they can see a sense of me in her eyes and around her mouth.
No, I had listened to some of... Rose has been very busy doing a lot of appearances, and I looked at some of them on your website. And in one, you talked about a book that you wrote just for your family that was about a family member. Tell us a little bit about that, and was that a good transition to writing an official memoir?
Yes, my background is in journalism, so it was kind of natural to me to interview people, and I decided to interview my father about his life. So I devised a series of questions which prompted him to talk, and I taped all the conversations, and then I typed it up, and I got everything professionally bound into a book. And this is the book. I called it Open Book with his name on the front. And it's written in the first person because I wanted to capture my father's voice. At the time I wrote it, I didn't realise how helpful it would be when I came to write Where Are the Grown-Ups many years later, because I realised that I had my dad's authentic point of view on a number of situations that I could draw on for Where Are the Grown-Ups. And another really interesting aspect of this was that my mother was very jealous that I was giving my father so much attention by writing his life story. And it was a very neat thing to do, actually, because the result of this was that she decided to write her own, and in defiance, really, because I wasn't giving her the attention, I was giving it to my father. So she wrote her...
That's surprising.
Yeah, she wrote her own life story, and she called it Just for the Record, and it's here. It's just a folder of typed up memories and information that she could recall from her growing up and her childhood, and that was fantastically helpful, because she had the attitudes and the personalities of the various characters that are very useful for me in writing part 2. And I knew some of those characters as my relatives, but I also had her impression of them as younger people in a different time. So that was very useful.
What a great resource.
Yes, and it was very clear to me as well what she didn't know, and the reasons why Rose had been airbrushed out of our family story. Looking between the lines, it was quite clear to me then, and that was very helpful in writing Where Are the Grown-Ups. So I had 2 fantastic resources.
That's wonderful. So somebody wanted to see your book cover. They hadn't seen it yet. So that's her cover. And the picture, is that your mother?
On the front, it's my mother, aged 3 years old, yes, and that was among the...
And you feel like she looks a little sad or lost there.
She does. There's something in her eyes, I think, that made me think about who she was looking for, who she was looking at, and it just appeared to me that there was something very sad about her demeanour.
Is that something you found when you were going through her things?
Yes, it's one of the photos I found, along with the portrait of Rose and the wedding photograph of my grandparents. Yes, I found all of those together. And I just thought they were wonderful to include in the cover in some way. And I thought they worked very well. Some people have asked me why I haven't put photographs inside. But the way I wrote it was as a narrative memoir. I wanted it to be a story, a true story, but I didn't want to distract people with looking at pictures in amongst the story. I wanted to tell the story and not have any distractions to that. So that's why I limited the photographs.
I did miss them a little bit, because just having a taste of a couple of them, I wanted to see a little more of them. Right.
When I do talks in person, or when I did them, when we could all meet up together, I did have a slideshow, because a lot of people said they wanted to see what some of the other characters looked like. So, I had a slideshow that I could share. But I didn't want to use up the time here, because some of your questions are so interesting. I thought it would be good just to limit it to the cover images and the key things that I found I wanted to share with you.
Okay. So how did you conduct your research about Rose and your family? And what pieces of the puzzle were the most helpful?
A few years before I started writing, or even thought about writing a book, a good friend had done some work on my family tree. And it occurred to me that if I could see copies of Rose's marriage and death certificate, it would give me a lot of information that I didn't know. And it was only when I saw those documents and the information they contained that I knew I really had a story. I started writing really as a response to grief, and I didn't know if I had a story until I really examined those documents. It was thrilling. It was a thrilling moment, but it was also devastating, because I had dates, I had ages, I had addresses, I had occupations, I had a cause of death and a place of death. And when I had all that information, the photo of Rose and Reuben on their wedding day took on a much greater significance.
Talk a little bit about this photo of your grandmother and her husband.
Well, this is the 21st of July, 1929. And the information that I got from those official documents told me that this couple only had 10 months of happiness together. Reuben, my grandfather, became a new father and a widower in the same week, and he was only 24 years old. I think sometimes when we look at old photographs, people appear to be older than they were, but he was only 23 when he got married. And he was only...
I love her outfit and her flowers are beautiful. Talk about their professions, what they did for a living.
Yes. Well, my grandfather was quite an interesting character.
He is.
I think he was, what should we say, he could easily have been an East End criminal, it occurred to me. He had an interesting backstory in which I go into in the second part of the book. He was actually illegitimate. But without giving you too much detail, on his wedding document, his official certificate of marriage, his occupation states that he was a racecourse tipster. So I thought, well, I need to do some research about the history of racecourses in East London in the 1920s. And this proved to be very interesting because when you think about racecourses, I think, and maybe you do too, you think about horses. But in fact, at that time, a new leisure activity was growing very popular in the East End, and that was dog racing. And it just so happened when I started delving into this that a brand new dog racing track opened in 1927 within reach of what would have been Reuben's home. I thought, the opportunist kind of character that he was, I thought employment at this new track would be entirely plausible. So I put him in the dog track, and that's what he did for a living. Interestingly, when I looked at the certificate of Rose's death, her husband, next of kin, is said to be a boot seller. I suspect he would have been ashamed to state he was a racecourse tipster on his wife's death certificate.
Now, Ruth, Rose's job was as a cigarette maker, which is really unusual. I've never even heard of such a thing.
Yeah.
How did you find that out, and how did you research that?
Well, again, her occupation on her marriage certificate said she was a cigarette maker, but I didn't know exactly where she worked.
This means hand rolling cigarettes, right?
Well, there's a reason why she's a hand roller in my book. I didn't know where she worked exactly. There were several large cigarette factories in the East End of London at that time. But I also found out that during the 1920s, mechanisation was just coming in, which would replace the hand-rolling skills of the past. I spoke to a historian, and she told me that as well as the big factories, there were a few smaller, more bespoke cigarette makers in the area. And it occurred to me that new technology is never adopted by everyone at the same time. So in my mind, I thought that the smaller factories might still continue to employ artisan workers with hand-rolling skills. Now, why would I attribute my grandmother with hand-rolling skills? Well, again, from her marriage certificate, her father was a cigar maker originally from Amsterdam. This is a Jewish family, and cigar makers, Dutch cigar makers from Amsterdam, there was quite a community of those in the East End at the time. Many had emigrated to East London. And I rather like the idea that the artisan skills of hand rolling might be passed from father to daughter. So it was my decision to put Rose in that kind of heritage workplace. I thought that would be more interesting to write about, and it seemed to me quite plausible. My mother was a very petite kind of woman, very small in stature, small hands, small feet. I'm rather the same. So I just pictured Rose as having these small dexterous hands that she's passed on to two generations. I'm not particularly dexterous in my hands, but I use my hands for writing, don't I? And typing. So I quite like that idea of what could be passed from generation to generation. So that's how I place them in their occupations, and that was some of the research that I did to to make that authentic, which I hope it is.
Before we move on from your research, so you had the marriage and death certificates, and you had hospital records around the time of Rose's death. Your mother had a diary, and then you had the book that you had done about your father. What other sources of background did you use to research the story?
Well, I did a one-to-one walking tour with a historian, which was incredibly helpful. I wasn't very familiar with the geography of the area, but I gave her the addresses associated with my family, and she designed a route that we walked together, and she talked me through some of it.
This is the London of your grandmother's time, right?
Yes.
That's what you were looking at.
Yeah, the London of my grandmother's time and my great-grandmother's time. And the good thing about this particular area is that there are many landmarks and buildings that are still there that my mother and grandmother and my great-grandmother would have walked past on a daily basis. For example, the gates to my mother's school are still in place, although the building is no longer a school. There's a very grand private house close by that I know through the friend that did research on my family tree, that my great-grandmother worked there as a domestic servant when she was a young girl. And there's many historical archives and library collections that document the East End of London through many changing periods. Many waves of immigration, different cultures have populated that area and continue to do so. And it's all very well documented and accessible. Added to that, the really strange thing about it is that when we returned to the UK after living overseas for a couple of years, we lived in an area that was just a few minutes walk away from many of the places and events in the book. This was a total coincidence, though. It wasn't planned in any way. It was just, I realised that as when we came there. And it felt like my ancestors were guiding me to the places I needed to see. And it was very meaningful and really helped to keep my head in the right place for the writing to flow.
I can see being in that area and feeling like you're in touch with their spirit. Now, you also used Ancestry. What was that helpful for?
Yes, I did. There was other information as well that was very interesting that told me my grandmother, when she was a child, the family had done several trips to Canada, and I believe there were relations in Canada, and they went third class, but they went back and forth, and they found their names on passenger lists, and that was very interesting because it was within a year or a few years, 2 or 3 years before the sinking of the Titanic, and I used that information in a scene with her fiancé, who believes that there's a fragility about Rose that he couldn't quite put his finger on, and it upset him to hear that she travelled on the same shipping line that the Titanic belonged to, and within a couple of years of the sinking, and that there, by the grace of God, she could have been on the Titanic and he'd never have met her. All these things went through his head in a scene, which I hope emphasised their relationship. So there were lots of interesting tidbits that I could feed into the story that have come out of the ancestry research. You never really know what you're going to find when you start delving into these things.
Somebody had a question, and they said that they're working on a memoir and that one branch of the relatives held a grudge against the other side of the family for 60 years and they don't want to be contacted. Did you have any, relatives who were reluctant to be contacted or interviewed? Did you contact or interview any of them?
No, I didn't contact or interview them specifically. I understand what you're saying there, and I think it is quite delicate if you've got that kind of situation. I have to say that I was worried about my brother reading the book because his experience was different to mine and I wasn't sure how he'd feel about it, and that was one of the reasons why I didn't make my brother a fully formed character. I didn't want to put words in his mouth, but I was very surprised at how supportive he was of the book and how he commented to me that he thought I had the relationships spot on, and he's been absolutely, completely 100% supportive. I didn't have too much concern about being honest and frank, because I have to be frank about the parent and child relationships, because that's what the book is about. Most of the people I was writing about are deceased, and you can't libel the dead. There may be a couple of living relatives connected to my grandfather. In fact, they may well be in America. So they would be the children, grandchildren of his second marriage. And if they read it, well, it's all based on fact. I'm not telling anything that's untrue. So
somebody was saying, you point out the areas that are fictitious, but there's nothing fictitious. And I think it was a little confusing, your answer about your grandmother's profession. You must have had a sense that she did do that kind of work. Was there anything that you didn't know for sure?
Oh, there's quite a bit that I didn't know for sure. But then what I was trying to do was to get to the emotional truth of the situation. And yes, there were some parts of the book. I mean, for example, if you're writing about the past that you didn't live through, then how can you possibly know what the conversations were between people? How can you know if you weren't witnessing them and being involved? But what I was trying to do, I knew the outcomes, I knew the personalities, I knew the motivations. What I was trying to do was get to the emotional truth and also provide a satisfying reader experience. So I think really you have to weave that in to what you're doing. And I think that's what makes memoir creative and interesting. It's not about just relaying the facts. It's about putting on your own interpretation and your own viewpoint. I mean, and this is my truth. I'm sure that every life could be interpreted in a different way by different members of the same family, but this is my truth and my view.
How many relatives would you say you interviewed?
Interviewed? Well, I didn't interview them as such. I mean, I didn't have to interview them. I mean, they were.
Because you had your father's. You had your mother's.
Yeah, they were deceased. I couldn't interview them. The book has put me in touch with relatives that I didn't know I had, which has just been amazing. Rose had a sister who is a minor character in my book, and I mentioned that she died 2 years after Rose of TB. So her poor parents buried both their daughters within 3 years of each other. And I know that the sister, left behind 2 little boys, Leslie and Harold, who were 2 and 4 at the time. Now, I wrote an article for a newspaper that was published, and Leslie is still alive. And he read the article and said...
And who is he?
He is who is he? Rose was my grandmother. His mother is Rose's sister. So we are cousins.
I see.
Once removed. He read the article, realised this was his family, and got in touch with me. And he's 93 now, and that's been wonderful to meet him. And he's very keen to keep in touch with me. So the book has done some amazing things, really, and they've all been very positive. I haven't had any uproar or any dissent from any family members. As I said, I couldn't interview them. If I could have interviewed them, it might have been easier. But even if I'd interviewed...
Sure, it would have been. So when did you know you had a book?
When did I know I had a book-sized story, you mean? Really, when I looked at the documents and I realised that the situation where this couple had found each other, they got married, fallen in love, got married, everything was wonderful, but they only had 10 months of bliss together. And it just seemed shattering to me that Reuben became a new father and a widower in the same week in his 20s. It just seemed tragic. And of course, I also knew then that Rose didn't die in childbirth. I could unpack what that meant. In childbirth is such a vague description. She actually died of a very particular condition. which is postpartum eclampsia, which is a disease of high blood pressure that's unique to pregnancy, and sometimes the symptoms persist after delivery. She didn't die, according to her death certificate. She didn't die in childbirth, but 3 days later, so she knew she had a daughter. So this was very meaningful information to me, and it led me to want to know more about how the condition was treated in the 1930s in that place, and what the outcomes were for women like my grandmother. And for that, I was able to look at patient records, medical records, from the year of 1930 at the biggest hospital in that area.
This is the heartbreaking part of the book.
Yeah, for me it was. I spoke to midwives, I spoke to medical historians, and just looking at the patient records, you get so much information. I mean, tiny little things like there's a list of patients, and just in the names that you're reading, you're in a different time. I was reading about Lillian and Ada and Bessie, and they were a bricklayer's wife, tailor's wife, a milliner. You're already in a different period, aren't you, when you hear those names and you hear those occupations and the descriptions of their lives. It's so vivid. So it was very meaningful to me to be able to have access to that kind of history, to touch it really. So it was a marvellous way to access a different period of time, and to find out a little more about the condition that caused my grandmother's death. They did have drugs to treat that condition, but not everyone responded to drug treatment. It wasn't as reliable as drugs that we have today. So all these things kind of build the picture, don't they, of what happened and how it happened.
Can you talk a little bit about how you organized the book? You said that you think of it as 3 acts.
Yes. As you said in the introduction, I have got a theatre background, and I instinctively, once I got the basic information that inspired me to write the book, I knew my mother's backstory was going to be the crux of the book. But instinctively, I didn't want to start the story at the beginning and tell it all in chronological order, because I thought this would be a much less interesting reader experience. I wanted to make the story more intriguing. I wanted to create some drama and some suspense by letting the story unfold gradually. And I really wanted to do my best to make readers keep turning the pages. And I'm sure my theatrical background influenced that. I've written the story in 3 parts, and I have been told that it's like a 3-act play, and maybe it is, I don't know. I wanted to write about my own childhood in my own voice. So part 1 is really all about the relationship that I had with my mother, my parents, the breakdown of their marriage, and that was what I was witnessing really. I was subconsciously building a case against my mum, but at the same time, because childhood feelings are so complicated and complex, at the same time I wanted her approval. You know, I was desperate for her approval. So I go into all of that in part 1, and I thought it was a good place to conclude part 1 with my mother leaving the family home and my parents splitting up. That seemed to me the right point to then go back in time, because by then I wanted readers to wonder what has made this woman like she is, what's happened in the past to cause these situations, to cause these motivations. So I thought that was a good point then to go into the historical part. Of course, at the same time, I was reading a lot of writing craft books that said, whatever you do, don't go back in time, don't change the point of view, because you'll confuse the reader. So I had to be quite determined to make this work, and I did a lot of experimentation. I started off writing alternate chapters as mother and daughter, and I thought maybe I could tell the story that way, but then it got a bit too confusing. I got bored with it, and I thought, well, if I get bored with it, it seems too limiting. I can't really sort of expand in the way I want to expand the writing by keeping to that format. So I decided to start again and do the whole thing, part one in first person, completely from my point of view, and to start part two in a different voice, because I was going back to a time which was not my lived experience. And I thought using the omniscient point of view would give me an opportunity to explore, introduce more characters, explore more motivations, more situations.
This is for part two about your grandmother.
Yes, in part two. And then part three, I return to the part where my mother left home, and I give the reader what happened after she left home, right up until my mother's old age. And it comes full circle, really, because the book starts with my mother's death. So part three returns to that point, and it's a reflection then on the outcomes of Rose's death and what it has meant to 3 generations.
I think you have very rich characters. For instance, in the part about you, your mother is very difficult, but you're kind of cheeky, you have an attitude of your own.
It is a sad story, but I did not want to make it depressing. So I tried to include some light and shade, and I hoped there were some humorous moments where I'm maybe laughing a bit at myself, laughing a bit at the situations I find myself in. So I hope really that, that it balances, really, because I think to keep the reader interested, I think then it can't be unremittingly terrible and sad and brutal. If you can possibly inject some hope, some light, and a different slant on a few things, I think that's quite helpful, and it keeps it credible and authentic as well, because life is multi-layered, isn't it?
So you were describing your point of view. So the first act is from your point of view.
Mm-hmm.
The second act is omniscient point of view.
Yeah.
And then the third is it from your mother's point of view? I don't remember.
No, I go back to my point of view, and I explain what happened after my mother left the family home, how my father found several unsatisfactory partners, and how I dealt with that as a young woman, really. So we go into a bit of that and a bit of my relationships, and how that might have been some of the difficulties I got myself into with relationships. And then it moves really to when I had children, and my mother's attitude to me as an adult, an equal, and how our relationship changed and mellowed in time when my father remarried. There was a lot of friction.
You didn't feel your father was very choosy when he remarried after your mom?
No, my dad was he was such a softie. He was very easily taken in by people, and I just felt he wasn't...
He's very likable.
Yes, he is. I'm glad you say that. Yeah, he is likable and lovable. But it caused him some difficulties, and it certainly caused the rest of us observing the car crash at times some difficulties. But both my parents, they couldn't really be without somebody. They found being on their own very, very difficult. And I'm beginning to understand how that might be as I'm getting older, but I wasn't very generous when they were living. I didn't really understand that. So I hope in a way the book is me being a bit more generous, especially to my mother, because I wasn't that generous.
That seems like the healing is really about her.
Yes, definitely. I feel better for having told the truth, although it was quite painful at times.
Why do you think it took 4 years to write the book?
Well, do you know what? I saw an interview with an author this week who'd been working on something since 2012 and had only just published this year. But
Did you feel good?
I think I did well, really. It's basically reasons of geography and life. I wrote the first draft of part 1 in 2015. I was living in Dubai at the time. I could do a certain amount of desk research from the United Arab Emirates, but it's not the best place to find out about the Jewish East End of London. So, I know it's true. I mean, there's a lot you can do online, but you can't really get tangibly into that culture from the United Arab Emirates. So I used a couple of trips back to the UK during 2016 to gather information and to go to the places associated with my family. So once I moved back to the UK, moving from country to country is quite time consuming, so the writing went on pause for a bit. Most of part 2 was written after we returned to the UK in 2017, and that's when I had the opportunity to study the medical records. I have to say I got a bit stuck, as people do, in the middle of the book, and I left it for a while, and I needed to kind of let my head go somewhere else and come back to it. Then we had a house move to where I live now. Again, that's quite a time-consuming business, but once we'd settled in, I really made progress in 2018, and I cracked on with part 3. Plus, I also work as a freelance writer and PR consultant, so I had to put client work first. Sometimes my own writing had to go on the back burner if I had client work to do. So really it was a case of geography and life which dictated how long it took.
What was your writing routine like?
Very changeable, and it's flexible, and I don't beat myself up about it. I had a definite routine on writing part 1 because I was overseas. I joined a writers group in Dubai, and I submitted work for critique every fortnight. And this was great motivation. It was brilliant. I had the time. I was very keen to get early feedback from other people, and I had very few distractions. I could write all day. So that's how part 1 got written really fast. And the next day I would start by looking at the previous day's work and then continue on. I didn't notice time passing at all because I was just so in the zone. When it's going well, I'm still like that. That's when I know it's going well. And other times it's very slow and laborious. But I'm not one of these writers that gets up at the crack of dawn to start to write, or I don't start typing in the middle of the night. I'm an office hours writer, and as long as there's progress, however small, then I feel I'm winning. I'm working on another book now, and it's going okay. It's going okay, and I as I say, if there's progress, if there's weekly progress, then I'm winning. I'm also I've just finished recording the audio format for Where Are the Grown-Ups, so I'm doing the narration. So that's been another interesting learning process.
Tell us a little bit about that. What was that like?
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Of course, you're reading your own work, and you know how you want it.
Is it not abridged? You just read the book?
I read the whole book. Yeah, I read the whole book.
And how many hours did that translate into?
Oh goodness, lost count. But I know we made a lot of progress during lockdown because we built a kind of little studio set up in one of our bedrooms here, and my husband's the technical whiz, so he was doing all the recording. I was doing the narration. So yes, it was very interesting, and I learnt something really important which I'll pass on, in that I think with the next book, I would always do the audio version, the audio recording, before I actually do the printed publishing. When I did the audio recording, I made quite a lot of changes to the printed text, and I improved it, I think, because reading it aloud, I think you get to see how things sound and how things feel in a better way. And it was just a very useful exercise. I think I would always recommend recording a version of your book before you actually commit to printed publication. I'm certainly going to do that with the next book.
Somebody's asking what kind of freelance writing you did, or you are doing.
I was a journalist for 12 years. I worked on local newspapers, and I was a feature writer, so I was very used to interviewing people about their lives and writing features about them. Yeah, that was when I was working in newspapers, but now I'm freelance. I tend to write articles for my clients and send them to the media, but obviously it helped me to have those skills because I could write articles about my own book and send them to the media. So I would say that I have some helpful skills in the sense of self-publishing a book as an unknown writer. I had some helpful skills in the PR and media vein.
I want to talk about your publishing and also the PR, but I want to talk a little bit more about the book first. Mm-hmm. So did you ever have any hesitancy about revealing stories about yourself or your relatives?
Yes, when I was writing, there was a few things I thought, do I really want to talk about this? Do I want this attitude or feeling made public? But I decided the best way forward was to write it. Writing doesn't mean you have to publish it, because you've got editing. And
you decide later.
You can decide later. Editing's a marvellous process. But in the end, I didn't cut too much, actually, on some of the awkward stuff, because I believe memoir has to be an exercise in honesty. And many of the reader responses I've had have said that's what they like about it. They like the fact that it's frank and it pulls no punches, and that I'm honest about my feelings, even if they're uncomfortable.
Anything that made it in the book that you really debated about?
Yes, I hesitated about writing about my grandfather's second wife in the way that I did, because I only had my mother's version of that. There's always two sides to a story. I hesitated a little bit about that, but I decided that I would be true to her feelings about that woman. And I had evidence on both my grandfather and his second wife. I had evidence and outcomes of some of their actions. So there wasn't any point cleaning it all up just to be nice. I can honestly say I wouldn't have been able to write the book quite in this way if both my parents were still alive. I would have hesitated. I would have hesitated about being that frank. But I take the attitude, and I'm sure everyone listening to this will understand, that everybody's family is slightly odd in different ways. And I decided in the end, this is my family. My self-editing decisions were really led by two considerations. Is this remotely interesting to other people, and does it serve the larger story? If it didn't fit those two criteria, I cut it out. So that was really what I was aiming to do. And there was a few things I cut which actually didn't add anything to the larger story. One of the reasons why I didn't include my husband and my children in the narrative is because that's a separate sort of area. It didn't.
That was my next question.
Yeah, it didn't bring anything to the bigger picture, and I really wanted to focus on me, my mother and my grandmother, and how we were connected. And if it didn't fit that, then it was extraneous information and distracting. I didn't want to dilute the main thrust of the narrative. So that's really what led the decisions.
So what tips would you have for integrating historical background with what story you had?
Yes, I think I've read quite a few fiction writers who have written about a historic period, and it's always jarred with me when you get a sense that the writer has done all their research and they're going to put it into this book. They're going to elbow it in any way they can. And I think there is a danger with writing about a historical period that's outside your experience, that if you do too much research, it can actually hamper the storytelling and distract the reader, because you know so much, you feel it all needs to be put into the writing to be credible and authentic. But you still have to do the research. So I took the attitude that I absolutely immersed myself in the period that I was writing about. But there came a point when I put it all to one side, and in the writing I just let a few key details signify the time and the place. And I really felt I used what was necessary to tell the story and create the mood without piling everything on. I get very impatient. I'm an impatient reader, I suppose. So I don't like too much description that doesn't push the story forward. So I was very keen that everything should push the story forward, and that there were just some small details that would signify and create the mood, create the time, create the place. That's what...
Sort of like an iceberg. There's only so much that you really show.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot I don't.
Story.
Yeah.
How about getting started? If someone wants to write a family memoir, what tips would you have for them about getting started?
Okay. I think you need to decide your purpose and ask yourself some key questions. Who are you writing it for? Are you writing for just family and friends? Or are you writing it for because you want a wider reading public. And of course, both things are valid. And, you know, as I explained before, I did both things in different ways. Secondly, I think, what's the story you want to tell? Can you use the facts to write scenes and dialogue that will help readers identify with your characters and the emotional and physical challenges they faced? You might have so much information you don't know where to start. So maybe choose a character or a period in time that you find fascinating or inspiring in a way that's meaningful to you in your life now. Some of the information you have might be interesting to you, but it may not be relevant to the story you want to tell. If you think about your own life, much is routine, isn't it, and dull. It's the milestones, the significant events that have shaped who you are that will be of most interest to future generations. And I think this also holds true when you're writing about your ancestors' lives. The other thing to think about is who is going to tell the story. Of course, the point of view, will it influence how you tell the story? And I think if memoir, that you've got to have some first person, because it allows you to explore your relationship with the past and it anchors your narrative. And your lived experience is going to be of enduring interest to readers of the future. So that the similarities and the contrasts that you identify between your past and the now and their past, that it's all valuable social history for future generations. So it's really asking yourself those who and why and what questions, which will signal which direction you're going to go in.
Do you have any advice for the process of showing the manuscript to family and friends who may appear in the book?
Well, I didn't show my work in progress to family or friends. I just felt it wouldn't be helpful. I did show it because I belong to a writers group, as I explained before, and I did show it to the writers group because I really wanted to know if this was interesting to other people. Is this a story you want to know more about? And the only way I could find that out was to have a circle of people that were outside of my usual family and friends that could look at it with a critical eye. And that was extremely helpful. But I didn't show any of the work in progress to my husband or my friends or anybody in the family, because they would either have said it's brilliant, which isn't what you want to hear at that time, or they'll be critical without really understanding what you're trying to achieve, you know, in the bigger picture, or they won't like what they read and their feelings will inhibit how you proceed. I didn't share it with any family members whilst it was in progress. Before I published, I asked a school friend that I'm in touch with to read a small section in which she appears. And I wanted her to tell me if she wanted me to change anything. And she was happy with what she read. And I was very pleased about that. I think she was very flattered that I'd included her. But all the while I was thinking it's useful to know you can't libel the dead.
So you chose self-publishing over traditional publishing. Why did you do that?
I just feel with traditional publishing, you're really waiting for a third party to sort of approve your story. And traditional publishers are very led by commercial concerns. And I didn't have any illusions that this book was going to make millions of pounds for anybody. But I wanted to get the story out there. I wanted to get the story into the hands of readers and let them decide. So that was really what led my decision. I wanted to have more control of what was happening. With the self-publishing process, it's very popular now in the UK. KDP, the Amazon self-publishing system, it has a great deal of traction now because some best-selling authors are self-published, and so that side of things can no longer be dismissed. It's taken quite seriously now.
Did you use KDP?
I used KDP, yes, and it's a family project really. My husband started Ingle Books as our publishing company. He dealt with all the formatting of the text and the many technical issues involved.
That's convenient.
Yes, it's marvellous, isn't it? He helped me produce a high quality printed book. The cover design was done by my eldest son, who's an artist and a very skilled designer. He chose the fonts. The images were all belong to me. Amazon make it very easy to get your work out there, but of course a writer still needs to work with professionals on editing and book design to ensure quality. Marketing and self-promotion is probably the one area which most self-published authors think is, the worst thing that they have to do and the hardest thing they have to do. I joined the Alliance of Independent Authors. I believe that's an international organisation. They are a goldmine of useful information on all aspects of self-publishing because it's a very complex area and it's not always very easy to work your way through all the decision-making involved, especially if you want to produce an e-book as well as a printed paperback. Amazon may not be the best route for everyone for a number of reasons, but self-publishers do have a range of options. And there are membership organisations and forums for guidance. So to me, it was no contest. I could write the story that I wanted to write. I could get it out there and I could gauge reader response and I could, see where my own efforts could take me. And I've been very, very...
You also had friends that were published traditionally and you saw what they were going through, right?
Yes, I did. I did a couple of events with a traditionally published author who's, sells a lot of books, who's very popular. But I could see what kind of treadmill she was on. That no sooner had she written one book, there was a small window where the publisher gave it some promotion and publicity. And this author had to turn up at various events and do her thing. But then, bang, it was, well, where's the next book? And you were like on a treadmill. And I didn't really envy her that at all. It seemed like a lot of the fun stuff was eliminated. A lot of the stuff that I find fun, which is talking about my book and speaking about my book and engaging with readers and interest groups. That's the bit I find really interesting and fun. But the traditional publishing route, it kind of eliminates all that for you because it's all gone into this corporate thing, which they do that in the marketing department and you're not really involved. But I wanted to be involved. So to me, I was never seeking a traditional publisher for that reason. Of course, if somebody in LA wants to make a film, I'll be very happy to talk to them.
So you do PR for a living. How have those skills helped you promote the book? How have you used your PR skills?
Well, it's helped a lot because I know what the media will like and I know what they will or they won't use. I know how I know how to write a press release that conveys information in a media-friendly way, and I'm quite good at thinking of angles to my book that will appeal to different audiences. Just this week, I made contact with the Jewish Genealogical Society of Los Angeles, and I hope I'm going to do an online talk specifically for them next year because that's a whole wealth of interest groups that have opened up for me because of the content of my book. I'm talking to a special interest Facebook group in the UK next week. I've also been asked to take part in an interview that will be filmed at my local theatre next month to be screened on their online site because, of course, they can't have audiences. I've been interviewed on BBC Radio several times and the book's been reviewed by National Magazine. I've written articles for the media myself and featured in local and national newspapers.
What are some angles for pitching your book as a story?
Well, I've talked to lots of people who do genealogical research, talking about the documents I found that were very important to the narrative. I talk to family history societies that are interested in how do they turn facts into a narrative. I talk to writing groups about, like yourselves, about the point of view and the decisions I made about how the story was going to be told. I've talked at book festivals. I was invited to a book festival in the East End of London and they wanted me to talk about my book because it was local history to them. So there's a whole wealth of stuff that's kind of local interest, the East End of London local interest. So there's a few independent bookshops that have copies of my book that they put in their local history section. So there's all kinds of spin-offs that have been...
I was going to ask you about bookstores, if you sell in bookstores.
A few independent bookshops. There's some in the East End of London that stock my book. And where I'm living now, wherever you live, you are a local author. So my local independent bookshop in Colchester stocks my book. And I've done talks at local bookshops about the book. I belong to a reading group. I belong to a women's group, and I've talked to both of them about the book. It kind of, once you start, you get more and more ideas, and the more things you do, the more credibility you have with the next group of people. So it's success breeds success, and it's surprising to me. But I don't think what I've done is unique in any way. I just think most people could do this for themselves, but the thing with authors is that they think all the effort has to go into the writing, which of course you have to have a fantastic book. But I think when you finish writing your book, you've got to be prepared to speak and write about your book. And that's another whole different thing, which a lot of people shy away from. But to me, that's the interesting part. Speaking and talking about your book.
Any final words of advice for people considering memoir?
I think it's a good thing to read as many memoirs, and books about craft, writing memoir craft, are very helpful if you're working on a family memoir. They help you clarify your thoughts on voice and point of view, sensual details that give the reader a sense of the time, and editing to avoid going off at tangents that don't propel the story forward. Now, you don't have to follow all the advice that you read, as I didn't, but it really helps you to make decisions in a considered and informed way and view your work through your reader's eyes. I think that's really important to look at what experience you're giving the reader when you're working on a family memoir.
So you have a new book you're working on. It's a travel and food memoir, which sounds like a lot of fun. What inspired it, and how is that coming along?
It was inspired really by the restrictions imposed by the current pandemic. So what it is a nostalgic look back at some of my most memorable travel, dining and live entertainment experiences from the last few years. To me, travel, dining out and live entertainment, these are the great pleasures of life. And they've been temporarily altered and in some cases postponed indefinitely. So I decided to put some of that content into a book. There's all sorts of little gems in there about moving to another country.
So where can people get your memoir?
It's available on Amazon.com. Just simply type in the title, Where Are the Grown-Ups? And it comes up, Amazon.com. It's also available from the Book Depository. I am also, the print version is also with Ingram Spark. Amazon.com will have the printed version and the ebook as well. I'm told that if you go into bookshops and request it, that a bookshop will be able to order my book through Ingram Spark.